Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Camilla Palmer. We're going to try and run this as a bit of a conversation, but I think, Camilla, maybe you'd like to start by telling everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in mediation, and then we maybe move into the areas of what you do. And we were talking before we started about the possible differences between workplace and employment. So Camilla, over to you.
Thank you, and hello everyone. So just a bit of background, which is really how I got into mediation eventually, is that I was for about 20 years I was an employment litigator. Acting for mainly employees, but not always. And what I saw was the stress and damage and costs incurred by claimants and obviously respondents as well, and decided I didn't want to go through that process anymore. So I set up what was an innovative charity, a legal resolution charity called YES, and the idea, Your Employment Settlement Service. And we advised employers and employees how to resolve disputes without litigation. So we never got involved in the litigation process. And our strapline was "Life's too short to litigate." And what I learned from that was that the whole process of constructive dialogue achieved much more for the employee and the employer than going through the litigation process. They got better results, fewer costs, less time, all over quickly. And because I could compare my advice at YES and what happened, my litigation. So I then moved on, and for the last 3 years, I've been doing only mediation. I am a fee-paid judge. I have to say that because I'm not a salaried judge. In other words, I'm not a full member of the judiciary, and therefore I cannot talk about any policy matters on ADR, but I can talk about the processes. So that's the reason for that. So what I'm going to talk about today and discuss, I hope, with you is, first of all, I think it's important to talk about the barriers to mediation and early resolution, the different types of dispute resolution. There's workplace on the one hand, which is really mediation to try to help employees communicate better, work with each other. So generally, it is about maintaining the working relationship, but making it better. It's not about money. And the employment commercial mediation, as it's called, I was always confused about this, is when really there is money involved, whether it's equal pay or whether it's an exit package and settlement agreement. And they are quite different, and there is different training. And I think there is the main difference as well is that employment commercial mediation, which is about money, can be done quite easily online, but it's much more difficult when you're trying to, I had a workplace mediation the other day where 4 employees were not getting on well. You really need to be in the room, and they need to be in the room with each other during the mediation. And that's much harder to do online. Anyway, that's something which perhaps we can discuss. And one of the, I think, interesting questions is whether, if you're going to choose a mediation, whether you go for a private mediation, which of course can happen at any time, or you go for a judicial mediation, which obviously can only happen once the claim and response have been filed with the tribunal. The other interesting question, I think, is when to mediate. Are there any constraints? I think there are all sorts of assumptions that, for example, you can't mediate in the middle of a grievance. I think it's wrong. I think mainly you can mediate at any time. It's almost never too early and never too late. I say that with a little caveat, which is obviously if there's just a sort of difficult relationship you want to have between 2 employees, you try and sort that out and not go straight into mediation. But as soon as there's any real conflict, I think that mediation is always the best way forward. And I'm also going to talk about this new judicial, and it's called non-consensual appointment, not mandatory. Of course, as we know, most mediations are all voluntary, but there is a lot of discussion coming from the senior judiciary at the moment about I suppose I'm not supposed to say mandatory, but it is mandatory mediation. So just starting with a question of barriers to mediation, I think I set up when I was at YES something called DRAW, which was a free mediation service to the mainly voluntary sector or low paid or small employers in London. And I ran it for a year, 2 years, I think. And it wasn't very successful. And I often wondered why. And a lot of the time, the employer would not engage with the mediation. Sometimes the employee would not engage with mediation. And I think there's a real problem that we all know what mediation is, but an awful lot of people don't. It's something which is, they know about the grievance, which in my view, do more harm than good. And it's easy just to stay with the process that you know. And I think that there's a lot of lack of knowledge about the advantages of mediation. I mean, I have come across when the judicial mediator, particularly the claimant, the employee, just doesn't really understand the process. So if there is a litigant in person in a judicial mediation, I would usually, whether it's the employee or employer, talk to them and explain exactly what it is, that it is informal, flexible, and basically the parties have control. Obviously, it's a voluntary process, so any party can just leave at any stage. No one has ever left, I have to say, in any mediation I've done. Probably your experience is the same. But once the parties are engaged in the mediation process, it's unusual for either to leave the room.
So, Camilla, I was just, if you forgive me, I was just, we've got a little question in the sidebar here. I was wondering what year YES was set up. So what year was
2014.
Okay, and then sorry to interrupt again, but I was just going to ask about judicial mediation. Is that a judge mediating, but somebody who's separate from the one who might actually deal with the case? Is that what we're talking?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Great.
We'll talk about judicial mediation in a bit more detail, but that's absolutely right.
Sorry to jump in, but yeah.
No. Well, it's always good to have a discussion rather than just listen to me.
No, we're quite happy to listen to you. Carry on.
No. I meant that. That wasn't. With judicial mediation, it's always a judge who mediates. And in fact, I was involved in the training of employment judges a year ago. And most employment judges, certainly the ones who are salaried, have been trained in mediation. And so that is very different. I think there was some concern by people about judicial mediation that the judge was just a messenger. That is very much not the case now, that they are trained as mediators. So and I also think that a lot of people don't understand all the benefits of mediation. I mean, one thing which is interesting as well is a lot of employees say, I want my day in court. But in fact, in a way, you have your day more in court in a judicial mediation than you do in an actual court hearing, because you can tell the employment judge exactly what's happened. You can have a discussion with the respondent to say, this is what happened and why I'm so upset. Whereas in the tribunal, of course, everything is done by witness statements. All that happens is this cross-examination. And we all know that mediation saves time, money, stress, reputation, etc. So one of course, there are, I'm just going to go through now, actually, the different types of resolution. So I think just moving on a bit, the quite a lot of big employers now are implementing sort of early resolution policies, trying to avoid the huge amount of time and frustration and anger really that's involved with the grievance process. I mean, I've experienced the grievance process when I was a litigator, and basically it just ratchets up the dispute, makes everyone more and more angry. And I think it is to be avoided at all costs. I don't know if any of you will think differently, but there's also a new group that's just been set up consisting of in-house employment counsel, who are trying to work out how to implement early resolution to avoid the grievance. Some of them have already implemented these processes, others are trying to do so, but it's not, sometimes it's successful, but sometimes it's not. And I think it comes back again to the fact that there is really not enough knowledge about the advantages of mediation. So of course, resolution can happen right at the beginning of any conflict in the workplace, and I think that the earlier the better. Obviously, there's also the workplace mediation question, I think, which is interesting, is whether the employer, usually who is going to put forward the proposal of mediation, uses an internal mediator or brings someone in from the outside. I think the problem with an internal mediator, of course, is the employee may not have confidence that they're impartial. And of course, we all know that as mediators, it's absolutely essential to be impartial. So there's early resolution policies, there's workplace mediation, there's employment/commercial mediation, where there's usually an exit package, including compensation. Usually there's an external mediator, and if it's private, it can take place either at any time before, during, after the tribunal hearing until the remedy has been decided. And then there is judicial mediation, which is not everyone is entitled to judicial mediation. It now it's usually where the case is going to last more than 3 days and sometimes more than 5 days. And usually it's the judge, the regional employment judge, or whoever it's delegated to, will decide whether the case is suitable for mediation. Usually that happens after, there's always, in discrimination and long cases, there's what's called a preliminary hearing in the tribunal to go through the issues. And one of the issues is whether the parties want judicial mediation. And so it's not, and then the mediation can be fixed much earlier than the full merit hearing. So if you have the hearing of 6 days, it's likely at this moment to be about a year before you get the hearing. And obviously mediation can be fixed at a much earlier stage.
Actually, just pausing there, we've got a couple of questions in the sidebar here about how judicial, how the judges are changed in judicial mediation. Do they use shuttle, in other words, private meetings and stuff? Do they all have to complete? Maybe you could just address those couple of points, but I think it'd be quite interesting. And how comfortable are they with doing it? It sounds from what you say as though they may be pretty comfortable, but we'd be very interested in how the training works, I think.
Yeah, well, there was 2 days of training for all the salaried employment judges, and a lot of, when I was at the training, a lot of people said, I'm really looking forward to trying to do judicial mediation. And I think that the judges are very much in favor of mediation. and want to do mediation. Not all of them, obviously, but a lot do, and they're all done online, using either Teams or the judicial CVP remote video. And sometimes you get 2 rooms on CVP, as I call it, but sometimes you just have 1 room. And the way it works is that you generally have a plenary where you explain what mediation is. What I do is, if it's a litigant in person, I usually go and talk to the person first to say, you know, this is very informal, this is very flexible. You're not going to be asked to do anything you don't want. I can't actually tell you what to do. My role is absolutely the opposite to being an employment judge. I take my judge hat off and put my mediator hat on, and I'm here to help you try and find a resolution. So I think that's very much more the way that the mediations are done. But obviously I can't tell you what happens in every single tribunal. And what I would say is that the process is different in different tribunals. So some people do a mediation over the phone, some do it through CVP. I used to, in lockdown, do it through either Zoom or Teams. So there are whole different ways. But I would say I certainly would recommend judicial mediation now. It is taken very seriously, and the judges are quite keen on it. Any other question on it? I mean, of course, there are, just to briefly go through the differences, of course, it's the tribunal who decide. I'm just looking at the chat. Someday I can't see the whole of it though, but I'll just go through the differences, and maybe we could then have a chat about whether to go to private or judicial mediation.
Yeah.
The availability and timing is the availability and timing are decided by the court, by the tribunal, and it happens generally after a preliminary hearing, not before. And private mediation can happen any time. It's all of them are trained in mediation. I think there's one advantage of having an employment judge is that they know exactly what's going to happen at the tribunal.
Yeah.
And although they do not give advice, they will say, well, for example, it's unlikely that the tribunal will do this, like award, I don't know, £250,000 for injury to feelings or something, which is, so I think legal information can be given, but not legal advice as to the merits. But of course, in private mediations, you have a choice of mediator. Judicial mediations are free, no argument about who pays. Documents are limited. I think this is a really good idea. I do not need to read more than the claim, the response, the list of issues and the schedules of loss. It's not necessary to mediate having read all the documents, and there's no time anyway. And the judicial mediation time is limited, 9:30 to 4:30. I think it's perfectly adequate to reach agreement, which is what happens in most of the mediations I do, in that time scale. Sometimes it's a bit extended. And when I did help, when I was supporting employees, when I was a litigator, I remember cycling home at 1 o'clock in the morning because we only just finished. And settlements are usually done via ACAS with a COP3. So if there's an unrepresented claimant, the ACAS officer will go through the settlement agreement with the claimant, because of course, as a mediator, as a judicial mediator, I can't do that because that would be giving advice. So those are the main differences. So I don't know, is anyone has a view about whether they would go for private or mediation or judicial mediation, or any questions?
I don't know, Martin, does anybody want to put their hand up on that one? probably not. I
There's
had
someone with their hand up.
somebody got their hand up?
Yes.
No, no. Oh, there we are. Zoom user.
Cole would like to speak.
Yeah.
I'll let Zoom user go first.
Zoom user, come in.
Hello, I'm Catherine. I'm a medical doctor. I'm a law student, and I did mediation training through ATR. Yes, I'd go for judicial mediation. It sounds brilliant. First of all, it's free, so I mean that's got to be attractive to most people. And secondly, you know, there's people just trust judges, really. So I think it's brilliant.
Okay, somebody else have their hand up.
That's good.
Yeah, so Camilla, I mean, first of all, just to say, everything you've just said is absolute music to my ears. I could talk to you all day. But as regards the question about judicial mediation, I've just actually shared a blog that I did recently about is judicial mediation.
That's in the sidebar, isn't it? Yeah, here it is. Yeah.
Is it an oxymoron? Because obviously one of the key things for us as mediators is to be non-judgmental. But actually, I think you're proof that I think some lawyers, judges, whatever, will never make mediators because their brains won't work in that way. But you're proof that that can happen. And you can be a litigator, you can be a judge, but you can also switch that other side of your brain. But my personal view about judicial mediation is it's a shame that it's got that far, because once the judicial mediation is on the radar, it's already on the tribunal's radar. And actually, if people have used external mediators, or to your point about internal mediators, some of the benefits or otherwise, if we can get those skills into organizations where actually managers, HR, people who usually deal with grievances can have these skills, then actually there's no need for it to go up the tree. So it's all about nipping issues in the bud. And an internal mediator, when a little fire starts to happen, when they use their skills, they could potentially stop it needing the external mediator and therefore the judicial mediator.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Camilla, you mentioned ACAS, and I haven't noticed ACAS, that we've got plenty of strikes in the public sector and elsewhere going on at the moment, or rather more works, you know, sort of overtime bans and things on the railways. What is ACAS up to these days? Because does anybody bother to use them? We used to hear a lot about them in good old days of, you know, was it beer and sandwiches at number 10? But we don't seem to hear that much now.
Well, of course, for those who don't know, and I haven't mentioned it, there's the early conciliation process. And before you put in a claim to the tribunal, you have to lodge file a claim with ACAS. And ACAS will then talk to the potential respondent, and see if they're willing to settle. But it is very much a messenger service as far as I can see. Some people think that you cannot mediate privately if you're in the middle of early conciliation with ACAS, and that's simply wrong, I think. It's a misunderstanding. As to what ACAS is doing, I think they do mediations, I think, but many people think they give advice. I think I remember them saying, and they give about 9 minutes advice. That's all they have time for. They are very, very overburdened. But the early conciliation process, I think there were 91,000 EC claims. I think that's right, last year. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they will settle. I mean, I did sometimes, I have to say, when I was in, a litigator, say, well, you might as well put in a claim with ACAS, see if the employer will settle it, and if not, don't go ahead. So why not try it? So I don't really know what they don't have a very high profile.
No, that's what I thought.
But they are very helpful in judicial mediations where there's a litigant in person, because they will help the litigant in person agree to the or understand the COT3, which is usually the way that matters are settled. Sorry, but the last question, I just wanted to say, I can't see who you are, but totally agree
Pete
with
Cobby,
you.
yeah. Go on.
But the in-house conciliation club is interesting because they're looking to create a network of people who are interested in talking more about mediation, facilitation, and the opportunities it presents in their workplaces and in their roles. So these are senior employment counsel in, well, big organizations, because they'd only be there, who really want to try and avoid the grievance process, which is so damaging, and find a resolution, an early resolution. So if anyone's interested in joining that, it is only in-house counsel, it's not everyone.
Great. On we go.
Okay, so I mean, the next question I was just going to talk about is online or in person. As I said, judicial mediations are always, no, they're not always online. There are some which are done in person if, for example, the one party says, I can't do this online, I don't have the facilities. So you can ask for an in-person judicial mediation. I think I haven't really done one post-COVID, so they're not very common. I think that it's quite, I think having it online is a bit of an equalizer. If you've got if you often do have a respondent with 4 or even 6 people in the room and one unrepresented claimant, in a way, and obviously the employment judge mediator, it's not quite as intimidating, particularly because, and one thing actually I wanted to say is that if there's a very, very anxious litigant in person who does not want to meet their employer in a judicial mediation or whenever, I would say you don't have to meet your employer online or in person. We can do it without you having to have that meeting. And that is an advantage of the online system, because if you're in a tribunal room, you could bump into your opponent anywhere in the building.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. In a funny sort of way, I don't know what other people feel, I find Zoom mediations or whatever are in a way less confrontational because of the way if you're in an in-person mediation, you go around, make sure the mediation agreement is signed, and then you then get people together, and sometimes it's quite awkward. Whereas with a Zoom, mediation, by definition, you will sign up the mediation agreement before you start, and it's a bit more of a chat like we're having now. I don't know what you think about that. And I have, we've maybe all had mediations where people don't want to be in the same room, even maybe in the same room virtually.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And it's always, I think the thing about understanding mediation is that the party, whoever you're trying to persuade to mediate, has control. Because if they don't like it, they can just leave.
Yeah.
And so if they don't want to meet,
they obviously don't leave your mediations, but which is great. Yeah.
If they don't want to see the respondent, they can just say, well, I'm not going to continue. That did happen once with when I was supporting a litigant in person, and the mediator said, no, you have to have a plenary. And I said, what? She's not going to do it. She's just not going to do it. This is not going to happen. So if you want the mediation to continue, it is necessary to have separate rooms. So I think that that control is the fact that you have control, and you have no control, of course, in the tribunal, or very little control. You're told what to do by the judge the whole time. But I mean, there are a huge advantage, aren't there, of online as well, apart from it works. It's quick and easy to organize, don't need to find a location, less expensive, no traveling costs, very flexible, moving from one room to another. And for some, I always start mediation saying, there's bound to be a technical hitch or some hitch sometime in the day, because there usually is. And, if a child comes into the room or a dog barks or the doorbell goes, just don't worry about it, or you lose the link. Don't worry about it. We're always sorted out. It's not, just be very relaxed about it. So I think that well, that's obviously what we all want to do. We want both parties to feel comfortable in the room, and in order to try and find a solution. But as I said, I think it's problematic in workplace mediations where you are trying to mend relationships between employees. They really need, sometimes they refuse to meet with the employee they're warring with, but I try very hard to encourage a meeting, because I think it means that the two people or the four people can understand each other a bit better. So I don't know whether anyone has any views at all about online or in person.
I think Catherine had her hand up again, actually.
Yes,
Catherine.
it's not actually about that, but I think I was interested to hear that you did think that online worked well, and listening to you, I can hear the arguments. So that surprised me in a good way. But I was going to say, I think your comment about people sort of get their day in court, they think, with a judicial mediation, I think is really true, because if you are a particularly aggrieved, oppressed individual who really hasn't had sort of non-biased kind of intervention up to that point, it's a relief to find somebody truly neutral, but also, whose kind of reputation as a group is that they are unbiased. And even just to be able to kind of offload and be told they're there, dear, is hugely cathartic. I'm sure it's hugely beneficial, and not just for the actual mediation per se, because they sort of get their day in court because they're talking to a judge, even though the judge's role is not the same to many people. Just the fact that they're a judge would be helpful.
Mm. The other thing I want to say, which I think is really important, is, and I say to employers only as a sort of, when I think it's appropriate, don't underestimate the power of an apology. It doesn't mean you're going to say, I'm very sorry, I discriminated against the claimant. But some sort of recognition that the claimant has had a difficult time can be the difference between success and failure of a mediation. But it's always hard, and lawyers hate anything like an apology, because it seems as though you're somehow accepting liability.
Yeah.
I can see a hand up, but I can't.
It's Pete Colby again. Pete, did you want to come in quickly?
I hear that a lot, Pete Colby again. Sorry, no, just to give an example. So a mediation we did 3 weeks ago had been registered for tribunal. The issue had been going on for 5 years, disability discrimination, and it was settled in a day, and it resulted in a settlement agreement, etc. But the apologies at the end from the employer, because they felt in that mediation environment that they could have those honest conversations, and there was lots of tears from the employer and things. And like you say, Camilla, those genuine apologies are very, very cathartic, but also knowing that you've not got a 5-day case to go to as well is incredibly cathartic as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I think the other thing I can say is I know what it's like going through the litigation process, because I've done it. And in fact, I stopped doing it because I knew how very harmful it was particularly to the employee, and stressful and costly and all the rest. I can see 2 more hands up, but I don't know who you are.
Oh, well, we've got Dave Watkinson. Do you want to go, Dave? Unmute, Dave.
Very much. Yes, I've unmuted myself now. Just on online or in person, I'm rather betwixt and between on this. And I think it really does boil down to making that jump case by case. I've noticed that while we were in lockdown and we were doing online mediations, that had to be because there was no choice then. But after lockdown ended, my experience is that everybody wanted to go back to in-person mediations. And from my perspective, it's much easier to establish a rapport with people, get the sense of where they're coming from, if it's in person rather than online. One online mediation that I had, the one party I never saw because she never put the camera on, and that was her choice, and that's fair enough. But it was rather odd just addressing the symbol of a telephone on the screen. There are all the advantages of online, which which you said, Camilla. No simplicity of travel, there's no travel, etc. And you're absolutely right that there'll be a technical glitch somewhere along the line. The first on Zoom mediation that I did, we had multiple parties in it, each side represented. At some point during the mediation, I not only threw out the instructing solicitor for one set of parties, but I then excluded him from re-entry. How I did it, I don't know, but I did. And when he got back in, he said, oh, well, mediations usually get on much better without the solicitor present anyway. In fact, we had made quite considerable progress while he was away. There you are. I just
okay, thanks. Did somebody else have that? Thanks, David. Zora, did you have your hand up?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Camilla. So I have got two questions, please. One of them is actually already on the chat about the judicial mediation. Is there an ongoing assessment? Are statistics kept of the settlement rate, things like that? And secondly, during mediations, I don't know if that happens at all, but if there are any, of course, there are different power dynamics, but if there is a power imbalance that can affect the settlement rate. As a mediator, obviously, it's important to stay neutral, etc. But if you really sense power imbalance or anything, any sort of coercion, or how do you handle that as a third party neutral? And but does that really happen at all in practice? Because in theory, we are very strict that mediator has to be neutral, etc. But I wonder if in practice, if there's anything that is put in place to deal with those kind of issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The success rate is 65 to 70% of judicial mediations. That's the general rate. And I absolutely understand. It's a good question about the power imbalance. I mean, I think the mediator is impartial, but if there is an impower balance, then you can try and rectify that. So, for example, I think that the sort of reframing that we all know about, if for example, the employer, it's usually the employer with power, says, we're going to go for costs if you don't settle. I would say, how do you think that's going to go down with the claimant? And, do you think this is, if you want to settle, do you think this is something which is going to help settlement? So I would sort of question what I would see as a threat. And I would say to both parties, threats are not helpful in a mediation, whatever. Often there are threats. The employee may say, well, we're going to expose the employer, and the employer may say, we're going to go for costs. And I would say to both parties equally that threats are really unhelpful. So I think you can achieve more of a power balance than you can possibly do in the tribunal. That's just my view, and I'm very aware of power imbalances and litigants in person. And I think that if the litigant in person understands that you're there to help them and the employer, then that is reassuring. So yes, I think that's true, and I think possibly it is. I mean, the mediation where the woman didn't want to put on her video, she might have refused to attend an in-person mediation because she didn't want to be seen, and that was the only way that she was going to be there. So I would say, well, it would be nice to see you. And often what happens is that there's a refusal at the beginning, but then when it happened with me, she did say, okay, yes, I'll put my video on. So I think once you have the sort of confidence of the party, they're much more likely to be amenable in that sort of way.
Okay, on we go. You carry on then.
Okay,
Mark.
yes. When to mediate, I'm just never too early and never too late. I just say also, an early mediation may save the employment relationship, because, and of course, we all know that, you know, if someone does leave, then they've got to be replaced. And you know, there are a lot of cases where the employer does not want to lose the employee. And the earlier it's resolved through mediation, the better. I think before the grievance, if at all possible, I think grievances are rarely successful. If they're lawyer, they're hugely costly, and every single possible claim is included in the grievance, which I think is very unhelpful. And I think there's no question that if there's an ongoing grievance, it's still possible to mediate. You put the grievance aside and you say, let's mediate. And the same for early conciliation. So, and also any time during the tribunal hearing. So I'm just going to now just talk a little bit about the new judicial mediation process. So there are 4 ADR approaches in the judiciary. One is ACAS, which we've just talked about. The other is judicial mediation, which of course is consensual, confidential, facilitative, usually for cases listed for 3 days and over. There's judicial assessment, which is again consensual, confidential, but evaluative, giving the parties prospects of success and possible outcomes in terms of remedy. And there's now the dispute resolution appointment, the DRA. And I'm just going to go through that. It's not up and running yet, though you will find on the website the presidential guidance on alternative dispute resolution if you want more details about it. The purpose is to encourage the parties to resolve their dispute by agreement, and the judge will help the parties. The decision about suitability is made by the regional employment judge or delegated. It may be ordered even if there's previously been a judicial mediation. It's non-consensual, but not mandatory, confidential and evaluative. The parties may make submissions arguing why it's not suitable. It's for cases lasting 6 or more days. It's usually fixed for 2 to 3 hours and listed 4 to 6 weeks after the date when witness statements are ordered to be exchanged. So it's a very late mediation. Documents are to be limited to include witness statements as well, which you do not get in the early mediations, schedules of loss and counter schedules of loss. Just while we're on counter schedules of loss, what happens all the time is the particularly unrepresented claimant looks at the counter schedule of loss and thinks that it is an offer to settle. In fact, what it is usually is the highest the employee claimant would get if they were successful on all matters. So that is quite a bit of a misunderstanding. And so in this appointment, it's possible for the employment judge to express an opinion as to the strength or weakness of the claim or response. Settlement discussions are not expected to be discussed during the appointment, although it may happen with the parties' consent. The employment judge may then list a judicial mediation during the appointment. Failure to attend may amount to unreasonable behaviour, so lead to a cost order. And settlement will be recorded via a COP3 settlement agreement consent judgment. So it's not mandatory mediation, it's an appointment. So I don't know if any of you know about this. I think there's a very interesting discussion about compulsory mediation. I'm going to call it compulsory. There's a recent speech by Jeffrey Boss talking about the Online Procedure Rules Committee, which is OPRC, and they'll have oversight of the online court-based dispute resolution process. So obviously the dispute resolution processes will be online in the judicial civil cases. And he is very, I'm just looking at the notes I made now. He is very keen on mediation. And what is also interesting, because I once said to him, well, what about litigants in person? He says, it will obviously need to offer early legal services and advice in appropriate cases, which the new Lord Chancellor calls ELSA. And there's lots more which you can read online. So that is the new judicial appointment. What was it? What's it called again? It's really very, very, very new. The DRA. I think the problem. I mean, I'm in favour of all mediations, but I think that it's really difficult for a litigant in person to understand the merits of their claim and what they may achieve if they succeed without having advice, and an awful lot don't have advice. What I will say is also, just for those of you who practice in London, is that your Employment Settlement Service, yes, the organisation I set up but I'm not involved with, offer support for a litigant in person on the day of mediation, and that's funded by Trust for London. So the litigant in person gets the support of a solicitor giving advice during the day of the mediation, but not, as far as I know, before or after. And that makes a huge difference. At London Central, where I am based, I mean, I was partly involved in this with the previous Reg, Joanna Wade. It makes a huge difference. And the employment judges have said, you know, we would never have settled without a support of the litigant in person. And some lawyers, of course, and I think this is probably a good idea, will, well, a few lawyers will actually give the litigant in person £500 to get legal advice, for example. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I think that's the advice sector. My experience of the advice sector, certainly in London, is it's really, really difficult because there are very few experienced employment lawyers in the advice sector because the pay is so bad, is my view. So anyway, what do you think about the new appointment, and you know, anything else to discuss?
Well, I was just going to chuck something in. You know, for a long time, since 1997, we've had mandatory adjudication in construction contracts, and it's a bit rough and ready, but it's worked pretty well. And that's mandatory in the sense that it's not compulsory. In other words, if it's a construction contract, if one party wants to go to adjudication, then the other party has to respond. So that's kind of how it works. And I think that's quite an interesting halfway house. It's also been going on for such a long time, it rather gives the lie to anybody who says that mediation shouldn't have a mandatory or compulsory or whatever we want to call it element to it. So I think whatever we're doing is perhaps I just wonder whether we're making all this a bit too complicated, you know, that there's all these different acronyms and different setups and things, and actually maybe it should all be kept quite simple. And as we were saying before we started, there's a huge pool of experienced people out there, more mediators than mediations perhaps, and why not make use of them?
I mean, I'm probably in favour more now of mandatory mediation. At least you have to go to an appointment, because I think that would at least explain what mediation is, and lots of people don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see whether we've got any other comments. We've been going for 55 minutes now. So, Zora, yes. Go ahead.
Sorry, just one last thing I would like to. I'm actually doing a PhD on compulsory mediation, and
well, there we are. Good,
very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. So of course there are lots of discussions, but one thing maybe I would like to ask both of you, since you kind of told a few things about compulsory mediation, your opinions. What do you think about it being 1 hour? Because, you know, we just know that even in a 1 hour session, it would take some chunk of that will go to explain what the mediation process is. And so the way it's proposed to be implemented, so it's 1 hour phone call mediation. I would like to hear what you think about that, and whether that could be improved or it should be a bit different.
Well, when I was mediating during lockdown, and I was doing it with teams, and I was liaising with the parties directly before the mediation, I used to say to the parties, if you want to discuss anything to do with mediation, please let me know. And if it was a litigant in person, I would say, do you want me to explain the process? So I think having an hour to understand what mediation is would be really helpful. It probably could be done in half an hour. We're also on the CMC also developing this video about what mediation is. And this is it's quite funny, actually. It's a mediation involving a banana that someone left in the fridge. A new person was told, here, this is the fridge for use by everyone. But thought that everything in the fridge was for everyone. So he took another employee's banana. And it's quite clever because it's really simple. I mean, it's a bit silly, but it's really simple in that it shows exactly what the problem is. Often it's miscommunication, or it's, so I think that a lot needs to be done to get the message out there about what mediation is and the advantages. And I think that's why we don't have enough work. Because people simply do not know.
Yeah, there's a lot of education to be done about what one might call non-court-based dispute avoidance and resolution generally, and it's terrifying how many people still muddle up arbitration and mediation. It really is, even people who really ought to know. Okay, do we have anybody else up with their want to put their hand up and ask a question or make a statement? So we're at 9:57, so 57 minutes.
Anyone got a view about whether to go for a private mediation or a judicial mediation?
That's a good question.
I'll reiterate what I said earlier, Camilla. I just think that a private mediation would avoid the need to get to that stage.
It's timing, isn't it? Yes, you can do a private mediation early. You can't do and then there's with a private mediation. Actually, one interesting point is that occasionally I've been asked to do a mediation, and then the respondent generally has said, well, we've looked her up and she mainly acted for claimants. So we're not, she's not impartial. I think that's quite interesting, because actually if an employer wants the employee to engage, it's probably better to have a mediator who does actually understand at least the position of the employee and the employer, because they're more likely to trust the mediator, which is obviously the essential to success. If you don't trust the mediator, then it's much harder. It's much harder to to find agreement. So, I mean, I think that, so, you know, if you're choosing a mediator, and this is apparently a big issue for employers, I suppose, it shouldn't be really whether they've acted for one side or the other.
Yeah, I think actually I have a particular thing about internal mediators. I don't really see how they can be independent and impartial, but never mind. I mean, it's probably better than nothing is the answer, and at least they can do the kind of the initial explanation part, can't they?
Yes, exactly. No, I agree. It's better than nothing, but better to have an external mediator. I mean, there should be a pool of maybe in-house mediators, and they swap. So
yeah,
swap around. And maybe that's something that will come out of this this network of in-house. It's the in-house conciliation club, it's called. If anyone's interested, email me.
Okay.
Michael, Anthony is online wanting to.
Yeah, I saw Anthony. Yeah, go ahead. I saw that. Yeah, carry on, Anthony.
Yeah, I've got a couple of observations. I do a lot of judicial mediations as a barrister, as an advocate in judicial mediations, but I also mediate a lot as a workplace mediator. And I think one of the observations I'd make about when should you go for a judicial mediation and when should you go for an independent mediator, it depends very much on the case. I mean, obviously, it's great that judicial mediation is free, but there are a lot of downsides to judicial mediation. One is that most of the judges tend to follow a sort of commercial mediation style, shuttle diplomacy. They're much more comfortable with keeping the parties apart than having them around the table. Now, where you've got maybe a discrimination case where the employment relationship still exists, it's often really important to have the people sitting around the same table, talking to each other. And in general, in my experience, even where the relationship has ended, you tend to get better results when you get people actually sitting around the same table. Also, I find in judicial mediations, employment judges are not very comfortable where there are issues that are outside of the litigation that need to be on the table. So there may be, for instance, parallel high court proceedings about share options and long-term investments and things like that. So they're not very keen getting involved in trying to resolve those issues as well, because they're not part of the tribunal claim. But I've had some really, really good experiences of judicial mediation. I'll just give you two very quick examples. One was a 10-day case where on day one, my clients had made an offer to the claimant, which she hadn't accepted. We made it openly to the tribunal, who suggested that while they were pre-reading, we should have a mediation with a judge who was qualified, who happened to be in the tribunal on that day. We did that. We settled the case while the employment tribunal were pre-reading for the 10-day case. And the other occasion was Joanna Wade, in fact, at Central London. My case, everybody turned up. We had, I think, 5 people on my side, 4 people on the other side, and the case wasn't listed. We'd all got a notice of hearing, but the case wasn't listed. And so there was no judge waiting for us. Joanna Wade came down herself and suggested that we might have an ad hoc mediation, which she would perform for us. Again, highly successful, absolutely brilliant result. Clients delighted. So yeah, sometimes it's a great thing. Sometimes it's not such a great thing.
Well, there are judges like Joanna who think outside the box a little bit and not doing anything which is outside what is allowed within the tribunal. I don't mean that. But also we have to remember that everything is up for grabs in a mediation. And I've had mediations where, for example, the employer has made a donation to Black Lives Matter. So it shouldn't be, you know, if the parties want to settle everything outside the tribunal, then that should be possible. Obviously, the employment judge is not going to probably know very much about the share options, but they don't need to know about the share options. They just need to continue with the sort of going backwards and forwards in the negotiations. And I think also it is a flexible process. If it was me and the employees were going to continue working together, I would I would arrange, or I would encourage them to be in the same room together and have a discussion with me there. The other thing I often do is if I think it's appropriate, is say, how about council to council? Because sometimes council is feels more able to talk freely, it's all confidential, obviously, just with the other council and me in the room. And that is sometimes when there's a really complicated financial issues. And I think it would just be easier to have two to two. So I would always think about whether to keep people separate, whether to put them together, who to put together. And it would always be equal. 1 to 1 is what I say, not 2 to 1. Because then you get the imbalance.
Yeah.
So I think it is very flexible, and you just need to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, I did something the other day which I've never done before, and that was I was worked out the lawyers. This was a commercial case, although there was a lot of people stuff in it, and it was, you know, it was quite substantial. And I decided to put the two, as it were, principles together, and then I left them to it. And I've never done that before, and it worked. So, I mean, I suppose what we're saying, it's a very flexible process. Now and again, as you get more experience, you take risks that you would never have done right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So we've just gone 10. So you're very welcome to stay with us, Camilla. But Dave will say something in a minute about the next meeting. But what a fantastic session! I really have learned a lot. Not least the difference between employment and workplace, because I'd sort of conflated those ones, to use that ghastly word. So thank you very much, and I'm sure everybody would join with me and say, well, there we are. We've got Pete Colby on the sidebar. Thank you, Camilla, superb, and Catherine saying thank you. So thank you, folks, for attending. I think a very good session, because we had something like between 36 and 39 people, 9 people on all the time. So it was really, thank you.
I think, can I just make one last point, which is maybe selling myself, and I'm just, it's interesting that now Darcy Street Chambers have set up a mediation team. It's interesting that barristers are now doing that.
Yeah.
And I went there because they were doing that. So I think that is also a sign, if barristers are doing it, that really mediation is getting more traction.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, that's it.
No, that's great. Okay, thank you. Well, Dave, do you want to just mention our next meeting, and then we'll leave the meeting, because it's a Zoom meeting. We could have up to 500 people on this. We'll leave it open, and everybody can have a bit of a chat. Martin, you've got to sign off at 10:30, is it?
10:15, but I'll stop the recording now.